What is up, guys, and welcome to another episode of the Equestrian Physio on Air. I'm your host, Katie, a Canadian physiotherapist and strength coach with extensive experience both riding and training in the equestrian industry, and with a particular focus on empowering equestrians to treat themselves like the athletes they are. So today's topic, I put up a little poll on the broadcast channel on the socials, and it was a pretty solid, 2/3 of you that wanted me to cover this topic. So we're going to dive into exploring the commonly debated topic on whether imbalance or asymmetry in the gym is going to exacerbate asymmetry of the rider on the horse. Now, if you follow different equestrian strength coaches, physiotherapists, trainers, you've probably seen this topic come up in different iterations. And I've seen it a few different times. And controversially, probably, I might have a slightly different opinion than what some other strength coaches or therapists put out there. And so I think today it's going to be a lot about opening up that critical thinking side of things and really exploring what questions are useful to ask here, exploring what research we have to answer those questions, and then kind of coming to a conclusion. And you guys can come to your own conclusion, because by no means is this an extensive, unbiased review about this topic. You know, if you've seen the posts, essentially the claim is that if you have an asymmetry or an imbalance during certain bilateral lifts in the gym. So if you have a big hip shift in your squat, or if you're pushing through one leg more than the other, if you are twisting in any way, those kinds of things, that is just going to strengthen that asymmetry or imbalance if you keep training those movement patterns. And that is going to translate to you being more asymmetrical on the horse. So we're going to dive into that. But before we do, a few life updates. I went camping this weekend for the first time this summer. I usually try and get out for a few trips, but I haven't gotten much into it. Now we're into the end of July. So this was my first time out, literally just a one-night thing, icebreaker, overnight kind of solo trip in the backcountry. And I paddled in. It wasn't massive. It was 6 kilometers kind of all told, with a 500-meter portage thrown in there. And and then just in one night, back out the next night. And I do think it's I find a lot of this stuff that I do, whether it's backcountry adventures, being able to just jump on a horse and go for a hack with somebody or catch ride something, being able to even just have the confidence to show up and say yes to things. I have found that in the years since I have been showing up regularly in the gym and strength training, these things are just so much easier to do. Now, there's still always that hesitation. I know the first night I'm always out alone in the backcountry. I'm kind of having to fight my own brain. And that's telling me okay, if you packed up now, you could make it back to your car before dark. And realistically, I'm nope. I'm capable. It's good to push the boundaries of discomfort, both, mentally and physically sometimes. But it's also really interesting that that's, I haven't really been paddling that much this summer. And to be able to hop on my paddleboard, which is usually what I take out with, 40-ish pounds of gear on it, and go for, a total 5.5 kilometer paddle with a 500-meter portage, which ends up being 2 kilometers total when I'm doing 2 trips, without really any hesitation, and just be able to do that. And I was a little sore the next day, but I never had concerns about injuring myself, right? It was more just fatigue soreness. It was never oh, I'm actually going to worried about straining my rotator cuff or my back or anything like that. And not to say that it is recommended to go out and do things that you aren't that prepared for or that you haven't done a lot of recently. Ideally, there would be more of a weaning up period to that. But at the same time, the work that I've been putting in over the winter, the work that I put in the gym, my own cardiovascular fitness, my own strength, that's protective for me. And it also gives me the confidence to be able to do these things and to be able to go solo tripping, or like I said, say yes if someone says, let's just go out for a hack, or do you want to catch ride this horse for a show this weekend? That kind of stuff. And so it's just kind of a little bit of a reflection on that, and that it's not always just about showing up in the gym for our riding performance, it is about life too. So yeah, anyway, little touch on that. Without further ado, let's roll the tape. Hey, I'm Katie. I'm a physiotherapist, strength and conditioning coach, and lifelong rider dedicated to helping equestrians build strong, capable, resilient bodies, both in and out of the saddle. This podcast is here to empower riders of all levels with evidence-informed rehab, training, and education. And we're not just here to follow tradition for tradition's sake. We're here to challenge outdated norms and bring critical thinking and curiosity to how we train, ride, and show up. Let's get into it. So as I said, when we're diving into this topic, we really need to think critically about what we're asking here. So if the claim is that lifting heavy bilateral movements like a squat, bench press, deadlift, or even like an overhead press in any kind of asymmetrical way, so where we are compensating, there is maybe a hip shift, a butt wink, some sort of rotation, maybe we're pushing off more with one side, that is going to exacerbate or just like overdevelop one side more than the other. That's going to lead to an asymmetry, and that asymmetry is going to carry over into our riding. So if that is the premise, then we need to start looking at, what questions do we ask to either support or contradict that statement, right? So number one, do we have evidence that lifting asymmetrically is going to lead to asymmetrical development and that potentially carries over to our riding? Number two, are there risks to riding asymmetrically? Like, do we have evidence that even matters, right? And again, I'm not saying that any of these questions, yes or no, we are just posing the questions right now. Number three, what are the research benefits potentially of like lifting bilaterally as opposed to unilateral only? Is one superior to the other? Are we missing something if we cut out bilateral movements altogether? Number four, is there a benefit to movement variability and exploration, right? So like if we're moving imperfectly, theoretically, if we have, slight quote unquote faults in our movement, is that potentially a benefit? Is it a risk? What does that mean? Next question is, what is the definition of like perfect movement? Does it even matter again? And lastly, kind of just thinking like, do the benefits of bilateral lifting, even with a potential asymmetry, outweigh the risks of potentially compounding that asymmetry on their own, or the loss of benefits that you would get if you weren't doing that? And like, is there a way that we can counteract that? If there is still a benefit that outweighs that potential risk of compounding an asymmetry, can we work around that and still get the benefits of heavy lifting? So those are just the kind of questions that I really encourage you guys to reflect on when you're looking at a claim like this, right? Again, doesn't mean anything is right or wrong, just means that we are asking the questions. So first off, just diving in hot here. Do we have evidence that lifting asymmetrically or with compensations will lead to an asymmetrical development that will carry over into our riding? So in these kind of bilateral exercise, it's proposed that if we have a stronger or a more dominant limb, it may inadvertently compensate for our weaker limb. And then we could appear to be performing, a squat or another movement symmetrically, but actually we're shifting the load over to our stronger side. And that over time, these hidden imbalances might lead to this uneven development in strength, where the weaker side is just continuing to lag behind. And we do have some research on this. So intralimb asymmetry is a measurable difference in performance of strength from one side to the other. We can do just like a field side test for these kinds of things. So like how many single leg sit to stands can you do? And then we have very more exact measurements like using dynamometry or force plates to get force outputs to quantify these things. Normal asymmetries would be like small, kind of under that 10%. But if we have really large imbalances, they can be associated with negative outcomes, especially if we're like post-injury, post-surgical, stuff like that. We want to get to a very small level of asymmetry before we clear someone for return to sport. We do have a fair amount of evidence that asymmetries like that are greater than that 10 to 15%, which typically under that 10%, we think of it as, just normal sidedness for people. Those have been cited as kind of the threshold at which injury risk may rise. And so it is something that we want to address when we see it. especially in change of direction type sports like soccer, rugby, football, those sort of things. So why do bilateral lifts become a concern if someone has this lingering interlimb asymmetry? Again, the concern is that like the bilateral only training, if no one ever added in unilateral, so one-sided movements, it's not going to correct these asymmetries and is essentially going to mask them or potentially exacerbate them. So we're just kind of reinforcing them by never lifting one side at a time and always letting one limb work harder than the other. And we do have evidence to support this as well. So there's been some studies, for example, in plyometric training, where if we only train bilateral movements, we're never actually fixing that asymmetry and we're not showing a meaningful reduction there. But if we train unilateral movements, then we do actually see a reduced asymmetry overall. There's also the technical aspect that we need to look at, aside from just that strength imbalance component. So that if we have reduced mobility or tightness restriction or something on one side, we might unconsciously shift away from that, favoring the other side, which over time could lead to these asymmetric stressors on the body, which it may or may not be able to adapt to. So we do know that there is a potential to compound the effect of interlimb asymmetries if we are only lifting bilateral. And we also know that significant asymmetries can predispose one to a higher injury risk. I don't know if we have evidence to say that resistance training only bilaterally makes these asymmetries worse. And I don't think we have evidence to say that that carries over into riding 100%, but I do think it is a cause to look into these kinds of things and be aware of it. However, it's also worth just remembering that no biological being is perfectly symmetrical. Like we have different hand sizes, feet sizes. Most of our faces aren't symmetrical. A lot of women have different bra sizes, like one or cup sizes, one versus the other. Like these are very common things. And so we're not typically going for perfectly symmetrical, right? The goal here is that we want to avoid excessive imbalances, especially like post injury and like letting those things just stew without addressing them. But we do want to also look at, okay, if the next question comes kind of to the unilateral training side of things, so isolating one side at a time, is that better? And theoretically, yes, like we have evidence to say that when you are training one side at a time rather than both sides together, we can decrease levels of asymmetry overall. There was that jump study that I mentioned. There's been others as well. And personally, I do this all the time in practice, where if I have, in particular, like athletes coming back from an ACL injury or an ACL surgery, which is something that I see quite often, we want to focus on unilateral movements because I know they're going to compensate quite a lot in bilateral movements. That said, we don't avoid bilateral movements for that reason, but they aren't necessarily the only focus. So then coming to that next question, so question number 2, what are the risks of riding asymmetrically? So as riders, if we are developing or compounding an asymmetry in the gym, what does that mean to our riding performance? Again, I don't think we have evidence to say directly that an asymmetry in the gym will carry over to riding, but based on what we know, we can, make some assumptions, or we can just move forward on the assumption that potentially it does because we don't have information there. Now, if you ever follow the Center of Biomechanics or Hilary Clayton or any of those researchers, one of the things that they say over and over and over again is that horses are going to develop a movement strategy to compensate, to alleviate any discomfort or imbalance that is caused by an asymmetrical rider. And this has been shown time and time again. The horse does not want to be uncomfortable. The horse does not want to be subject to uncomfortable pressures or uneven pressures from the rider. And so they are going to compensate to avoid that. There was a study done by that group where they induced asymmetries in the riders by shortening one stirrup by a couple holes. And then they did a biomechanical analysis to look at the horse's movement. They found that with an asymmetric rider, the horse's back movement was altered, and they saw increasing range of motion, increasing hock flexion or fetlock flexion, stuff like that, which they inferred as a compensatory instability that was happening. They've also done studies on saddle pressure distribution with asymmetrical riders, and they found that riders who are visibly collapsed through one hip have been shown to increase the saddle pressure on the opposite side of the collapse. So if you're hiking up through one hip, you are increasing the pressure on the opposite side. And that riders who are leaning a lot increase the pressure through the saddle on the same side. And again, because we know that horses are going to compensate their movement to avoid that excess pressure, we know that asymmetrical riders are going to lead to an asymmetrical moving horse, which is potentially, not all the time, but potentially going to lead to an overload at some point, or at the very least, asymmetrical movement, which is going to impact performance. I always have this kind of internal debate with myself when it comes to addressing asymmetry, because I know that movement variability is generally good. People want to explore movements. And we also know that they're, below a certain level, small bobbles in form, small asymmetries are not something that we generally need to worry too much about. And especially when I'm working with athletes in other sports. So like snowboarding, tennis, golf, baseball, anything like that, asymmetrical movement is a part of the sport itself. Even soccer, there is like a stance leg and a kicking leg. There is a dominant side pretty much all the time. And so I don't tend to worry too much about asymmetries in those kinds of athletes. But when you get to equestrians, there is this unique aspect about us as athletes where our body is not the only one to consider, right? If I have a snowboarder who has an asymmetry in strength or mobility, I don't really care that much. If I have a golfer who has like significantly increased internal rotation on their leading leg and significantly increased external rotation on their back leg, and then they're lacking the opposite, I don't worry about that because that is a beneficial adaptation for their sport. But if I saw the same in an equestrian, that's when I might need to look at diving into and addressing that, because again, our asymmetries are going to influence the horse's movement. So while it's a very high, like low threshold for me to deal with it in equestrians, I don't care that much about asymmetries in other sports. Coming back to riders though, what's really interesting is that we actually know that riders who have been riding for longer and or at higher competition levels actually show greater asymmetrical patterns in the saddle. And again, this is based again on that research from Centaur Biomechanics in that group, but we know that riders tend to lean more to the right. They also show shoulder tilt and different pelvis rotation, and all of these things increase with riding years and experience. However, we also know that riders who have been riding for a longer period of time also have increased reports of pain. So it's really interesting that we see these riders with a laterality, and specifically this laterality where they favor the right. But then they also have potentially like more discomfort overall. And we know that novice riders don't tend to show these patterns. Like they show less synchronization. They are not as good at following the horse's movement. So they tend to be in conflict with the horses more. They also tend to grip a lot more. So gripping with their core or really overutilizing like their spine muscles. Whereas, riders that are more experienced have better muscle timing and movement, and then they are more energetically efficient. So the question becomes, is this asymmetry that more experienced riders develop a problem? Or is it a useful compensation that they have gained with experience? There's a few theories that are proposed behind this. One is that, we may be becoming more asymmetrical just because of our own biological occurrences. So if we're dealing with osteoarthritis, rotator cuff issues, spinal issues, like these are things that are very common as we age. They're not necessarily a pathology on their own, but especially because we have laterality on our own, maybe this is something that becomes more prominent as we get older. We also know that riders notoriously don't tend to invest a lot of time and energy in their own fitness and strength off horse. Now, that's also where, again, I'm hoping to change the narrative on this, and I am working very much, and I know a lot of you who are following me are not these people, but it is still like newer to the industry to have riders be training themselves off horse. And so potentially that's contributing to this cumulative laterality that we see and or the pain experience that these more experienced riders report. But we also know that the forces that are coming up from the horse are also asymmetrical, right? Horses have laterality on their own. So do we tend to develop asymmetries to accommodate potentially coping with these asymmetrical forces that are coming up from the horse? So we as riders develop asymmetries with experience to match the horse's own laterality? We don't actually know, right? This is all just speculation, but we do know that asymmetry can have a biomechanical impact on the horse, that the horse is going to change their movement patterns to accommodate that. But at the same time, riders who are more experienced tend to show this greater asymmetrical patterns, especially favoring to the right, which is really interesting when you think about it. So coming into kind of the third part here, if we were to say, okay, bilateral lifting is going to compound or at the very least not resolve asymmetry, and there is a potential link between asymmetry in the gym and asymmetry on the horse, and that asymmetrical movement on the horse is something that we generally want to avoid, then we can start looking at what would the consequences of avoiding bilateral lifting in the gym be, as opposed to adopting a training style that is, say, unilateral movement only. Now, we do know that bilateral resistance exercises, so if we were doing like, again, a barbell back squat, a deadlift, bench press, stuff like that, they tend to offer a few distinct advantages over training just unilaterally. And a big one is just greater absolute loading. So when we have two limbs doing the work, we can move significantly heavier weight than when one limb is moving it independently, right? So if I can deadlift, say, 200 pounds, that doesn't mean that I can single leg deadlift 100 pounds. It doesn't work that way. If I can bench press 95 pounds, that doesn't mean that I can single arm press 47 and a half pounds. Is my math right there? Jeez, I think it is. I don't know. I used to waitress. Like, I should be able to do mental math fairly quickly. And, you know, that's too many concussions ago. That skill is lost. Also, I just haven't been practicing it very much. But yeah, so like we can overload more effectively when we are doing bilateral movement. And that higher load provides a more potent stimulus for strength gains and hypertrophy gains, especially through these major muscle groups. And even just from a time perspective, right? Like, as equestrians, we are not super free on time to go and spend 2 hours in the gym every day. And so it has its reasons. Like, if you were only doing unilateral training, it would theoretically take twice as long to get through your workout as if you were doing bilateral training. So bilateral training allows you to get in a very high stimulus, higher probably than unilateral training on its own, in a time efficient way. Bilateral movements also tend to be very useful for just foundational strength. So a lot of these bilateral movements that we use, or we like to use, like the squat, the deadlift, bench press, stuff like that, they are compound movements. So we are engaging multiple joints and multiple muscle groups simultaneously. So it's not just a single muscle group or a single limb strength that we're working, but we're also building trunk stability, core stability to handle those heavy loads. We also have the neuromuscular adaptation to recruit a lot of muscle all at once. So our nervous system is able to fire that and coordinate the movement. There's also just like bone density improvements by, number one, dealing with those loads on your skeleton, and number two, having your muscles pull very forcefully on your bones, all of which is going to help stimulate those bones to lay down more density. But it's worth noting that that doesn't have to be 100% of the time, right? Like, if we are taking unilateral movements to a fairly high intensity, taking them fairly close to failure, we can see similar gains in both strength and power, especially in individuals who have a younger training age, so just haven't been going to the gym as long. You can see quite significant gains through unilateral movements. But as you start to kind of max out more of a capacity on that, or just even from a time efficiency standpoint, you may find that bilateral lifts give you more bang for your buck in an individual session and give you more gains in a shorter period of time overall. So yeah, unilateral lifts, when they're loaded appropriately, especially if you're doing, compound movements similar to your bilateral lifts, they can be super useful. And they're definitely one way to train. But we do know that bilateral lifts tend to excel in that absolute strength realm. So being able to recruit a lot of your body very efficiently all at once, and having that neuromuscular and connective tissue adaptations that come from that, which you may not see as much of if you're only training unilateral movements with generally lighter weights. So coming into another piece of this is just, what is the definition of perfect movement? Like, how much do we care if we have these small asymmetries, right? Yeah, if there's a massive hip shift or something going on in the bottom of the squat where you are shifting, 4 inches off to the left every time you reach depth, or if you're pressing overhead and that bar is, coming into like a 20-degree angle because one side is pressing that much more efficiently than the other, that's something to look into and maybe piece out a little bit. But if it's very minor things like a minor butt wink, a minor hip shift, a minor twist, a less than 10% difference in force generated through one limb or the other, or even less than 15, how much do we care with that? And is there even value to having little imperfections pop up here and there in terms of like movement variability and exploration, right? Our traditional thinking is that exercise technique is often something that should be a quote unquote perfect movement. It should be performed exactly the same way every time. And that, for your individual body type, there is a quote unquote perfect form that you should be able to execute. However, more modern evidence in the areas of motor learning and biomechanics, which is a lot of what I do in my job, has tended to like shift this perspective. And if you're actually really interested in diving into ecological dynamics, which is kind of one label for this type of thinking, check out Kathy Sierra or at Panther Flows on Instagram. She has an excellent course that dives into a lot of these topics and is really evidence-based. She's also just a really unique person, and she uses a lot of these principles in training and working with her own Icelandic horses. And so it's actually really fun to see how she's integrating intrinsic motivation, so the idea of being like self-motivated for things in her horses, using movement variability and exploration, and just trying to build up her horse's capacity to have a very large repertoire and different movements through which they are comfortable accessing. And so anyway, just as an aside, check her out. She's really neat to follow, and drop her a follow and or look at her course if you're interested. However, yeah, coming back to this idea of movement variability, we know from research that was actually done, like a century ago now, that as we move, even really highly skilled athletes, we do not reproduce the same movement the same way every time. There is always these slight differences in joint angles, force distribution, timing, all these things that are meant to create repetition without repetition. And we view these small fluctuations as generally a sign of like a healthy and adaptable motor system. We also tend to look at, the demands of different sports, equestrian being one of them, where we need to have a large range of movement that we can access. We need to be comfortable in a lot of different ranges and a lot of different recruitment patterns, right? Because we never quite know what we're going to be faced with. And so sometimes like having a little bit more variability in our training allows us to develop this like repertoire of different movement strategies. So having like this higher strategic variability that allows us to make these small adjustments when we need to. You can also think of it as like, if we have our load distributed in slightly different ways with each rep, it can help reduce that risk of overload because we're not moving the exact same way every time. We are shifting these forces around a little bit. And that allows us to distribute forces more generally over different tissues and avoid that, one area being overloaded and potentially predisposing it to injury. So if we don't have enough variability, so say you have a lot of joint restriction, say you have, osteoarthritis or back degenerative disc disease, something like that, and you're losing mobility and you haven't been working on it, and that is like restricting the amount of movement that you have access to in your day-to-day, over time, you are going to have reduced movement options, which means that you are potentially going to overload the movement options that you do still have access to with your day-to-day activities because you've lost access to all of these different variations. That has become more of a narrowed movement pattern. And that movement pattern, the one that you still have access to, eventually gets a little bit overloaded and eventually potentially causes pain. Not guaranteed causes pain, but it's just like when we have less variability, we can overload those patterns. So if we have this really like large motor repertoire, if we're exploring lots of different options all the time, and sometimes that means playing around with asymmetries, playing around with overloading one side or the other, that can actually increase our ability to spread these forces out and reduce, hopefully, injury risk factors overall. It also means that, if shit hits the fan, like say your horse spooks or something, like you have access to all of these different movement options to absorb those forces, to handle that impact. Even like, jumping, falling, stuff like that. You have a large repertoire of movement that your body is used to exploring, is comfortable moving within, and you can exploit those in those situations. Now, it is important to note that when I say like exploring movement variability, it doesn't mean that we're just promoting like blatantly unsafe technique, like, a really, really ugly deadlift where you see this 16-year-old at the YMCA trying to like max out when he's, only been deadlifting for a few months and, his form is all breaking down and his back is flexed and he's really just moving that bar super slow and struggling. Like that is overload because he's not prepared for that load. And you see that in his form breaking down. Same with like, again, really dramatic asymmetries that are showing up repeatedly in the same time over and over again. Those are things that we don't want to necessarily ignore, but we also, again, need to remember that there is benefit to exploring movement variability in a lot of different ways. There's also some really interesting evidence in, surgical rehabilitation, low back pain research, stuff like that, that those who have experienced injury or pain often exhibit too little movement variability and are often moving in a very overly like stiff and guarded way. And so often in my practice as well, I encourage these individuals to explore movement. Like if I have someone who has, I don't know, a 20-year history of back pain and they've been told by their doctors to never bend over, right? That is the person that I'm going to play around and we're going to use different cues and exercises and even games to try and get them to explore their movement in different ways and increase their repertoire of different motor strategies that they can actually recruit. So yeah, I think it's good to remember that there isn't really such a thing as perfect movement, right? Even in lifting, we can think of each individual having some variation of an optimal movement that is going to allow them to lift more weight with less effort in sort of the best arrangement of their body proportions. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that there is like a perfect blueprint for them to follow. The goal should be that we want as much symmetry as possible. We want as even a recruitment as possible, but we're also okay with exploring variability and playing around with different things and having these slight deviations that are just normal as an experience of, someone who's biological having a sidedness. Which brings us to kind of the ultimate question in this conversation is, do the benefits of lifting heavy bilaterally, even with a potential asymmetry, outweigh the risks of compounding that asymmetry, or at the very least not resolving that asymmetry, and that asymmetry potentially popping up in the way that we ride horses? Again, this is where my bias is going to come out, but I would argue generally, yes, generally the benefits of lifting heavy are going to outweigh that risk of an asymmetry, especially when we pair these heavy bilateral lifts with unilateral movements on their own. So you're going to get that neuromuscular recruitment. You're going to get, ideally, again, if you're lifting at an appropriate volume and intensity, superior gains in both strength and hypertrophy. You're going to be getting superior gains in terms of overall absolute strength. Plus, just like psychologically, mastering really heavy lifts, it builds confidence, it builds mental resilience, it makes you feel like a badass. Versus in unilateral work, right? People can take those heavy, but you generally can't take it to 50% of what you're capable of with a bilateral movement. So you're not quite getting the same amount of recruitment there. Plus, and again, this is just anecdotal, but I find people tend to underload the unilateral things. That doesn't mean everyone does, and it doesn't mean that if you're loading it to that same intensity that we want, that you're not going to see similar benefits. But, people tend to see it as an accessory work or as kind of an add-on, and they don't go as heavy. I do think the benefits of unilateral work are very, very useful because, yeah, we don't want to leave lingering asymmetries if we can avoid it. We also need to work on, unilateral mobility if that is something that is causing compensation in these bilateral movements. But at the same time, I don't think it's a reason to avoid bilateral movements simply because you're seeing asymmetry pop up. I think it's a reason to potentially bias more unilateral movements or bias more mobility training to address those asymmetries, but not to avoid it overall, especially because, again, we don't have evidence that it directly leads to asymmetrical movement on the horse, even though we do know that asymmetrical movement on the horse can lead to compensations. I would argue overall that the risk of not training, so the risk of avoiding these types of movements simply because you're worried about asymmetry, is actually greater than the risk of compounding an asymmetry with these movements on their own, right? I don't know. That was a lot of words, so I hope that made sense. But basically, if you're saying, okay, I have a hip shift at the bottom of the squat, so I'm just never going to lift heavy in the squat again because I'm going to make this asymmetry worse. One, you're never actually going to build the strength to have better control and movement in the saddle that just comes from being stronger. Two, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to, fix that asymmetry by not training, right? And three, I find that riders who don't train, who aren't doing anything off the horse, are often way more asymmetrical and way less controlled and way more unstable than riders who are lifting heavy and are training regularly, even if those riders are training asymmetrically in the gym, simply because they have a surplus. Right? If you are in the gym regularly, even if you're training asymmetrically, even if one side is training at like 60% and one side's training at 40%, if overall you are building more strength, more resilience, more mobility than what you need in the saddle, then that asymmetry doesn't matter. Like, I don't know, if we were to put numerical values on this, say that riding takes 50% of your capacity, say that riding, you are capable of lifting at 100%, but one side is working at 60% and one side is working at 40%. This is like if I'm just throwing numbers out there and saying, okay, your 100% is asymmetrical, but riding only takes 50% effort for you, then you're never actually super worried about that asymmetry because you're never actually reaching the threshold at which it matters. Right? I hope that makes sense. It's kind of like the way that I mentally think about it, but we want to over-engineer, and I'm stealing that one from Gus Olds, the rider movement. Check him out too. He's great. But we want to over-engineer our physicality. We want to over-engineer our strength, over-engineer our mobility so that even if we have these asymmetries, even if we have bobbles that pop up, we're never actually reaching a point when they matter because riding is such a low-intensity movement for us. That is the way I tend to think of it. And that is why I believe that bilateral lifting, even if you're doing it with bobbles, asymmetries, stuff like that, that is outweighing the risks of potentially perpetuating asymmetry. I feel like in this entire podcast, if it was like a drinking game, it would be like, hey, take a shot every time I say asymmetry and you would be all plastered by now. But yeah, no, I'm glad that I can say that word and enunciate still, considering that it's like 10 to 9 at PM and I just worked a full day. Anyway, if we're wrapping this all up, because I know this has been a long one, I know it's been a heavy one, and I thank you guys for sitting in there with all of the research that I've done. If I was to talk about, okay, what strategies I want to implement to, again, like potentially counteract any risks, if they exist, of exacerbating or compounding asymmetry from bilateral heavy lifting. One, this should be a no-brainer. Just do unilateral training, right? You can still do your heavy squats. You can still do your heavy deadlifts, even if they're not perfect, even if you're loading asymmetrically. Do your unilateral training. And over the course of time, that's going to work itself out in the wash. Right? If you give yourself a year of lifting heavy, but doing unilateral training, I can pretty much guarantee that you are going to see overall strength gains and hypertrophy. And at the same time, you're also going to see a reduction in that asymmetry, right? This is a both and scenario, not an either or. You can also, you can monitor and you can use tests for asymmetries. I will pop in the show notes a YouTube video that I have for a self-assessment. And it's like field side testing. So like single leg hamstring bridges, side planks, single leg sit to stands that you can use to test your own asymmetries and see, again, just from a, purely like strength endurance standpoint, counting reps, are you asymmetrical? By how much? How much does it matter? And you can read into that. We also want to keep in mind that again, a lot of these things pop up when we go too fast and we go too heavy beyond what we're capable of. So that doesn't mean that don't go heavy. It just means that gradual progression is our friend. We want to avoid ego lifting. We want to avoid going too heavy too soon, where it leads to this form breakdown. We want to minimize that risk by learning what is and exploring what is, an optimal form for us. Again, it's not proper form. And it is not one correct form. It is just what is a nice way for our body to move. exploring different things, because again, like, it doesn't have to be right or wrong. Sometimes it just takes exploration to play around with these things and figure out what feels good for your body, and then progressing over time. Lastly, I would say just, using objective feedback for your riding as well can be incredibly useful. Something as simple as every, 3 months, 6 months, something like that, have someone film you walking away from a camera, trotting away from a camera, coming back towards the camera in a straight line, and look and see, okay, are my shoulders level? Are my hips level? Do I see a big shift one way or the other? You can quantify that, and you can film over time if you do see a big shift, if you do see a collapse one way or the other, and work on these things in the gym. And then eventually come back to those videos, get new ones, and compare. And I bet you will see a lot of these things resolving as well. So anyway, that's it for me, guys. I know it was a bit rambly sometimes in there, so feel free to drop any questions in the comment as well. If you would be so kind as to rate and review, I really appreciate it. I know it's kind of the last thing that we all want to do when we're listening to a podcast, but at the same time, it really does help me. This is a newer podcast, grow and reach newer audiences. So drop some stars in there, drop a question, drop a comment. Happy to hear from you. And until the next one, I'll see you guys on the other side.